For 31 years, my wife and I built a life together in a quiet suburb outside Munich. We had a routine, a garden, a rhythm to our days that felt permanent, until the morning I woke up and she simply wasn't breathing anymore. Overnight, I went from being a husband to being alone in a house that suddenly felt 3 sizes too big. I remember sitting at our kitchen table weeks later, staring at a stack of bills and a pension that suddenly felt like it belonged to 2 people, not one. Nobody prepares you for that arithmetic, the loneliness and the numbers hitting you in the same breath. Before we continue, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments which country you're watching from. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Walter. I was 69 years old, retired after almost 4 decades working as an engineer for a manufacturing company near Munich. My wife, Ingrid, had been the center of my world since we were both in our 20s. We met at a dance hall of all places back when young men still had to work up the courage to ask a woman for a second dance. She said yes. Somehow she kept saying yes for the next 43 years. We didn't have a loud life, no grand adventures, no dramatic stories to tell at dinner parties. Just Sunday walks along the river, coffee at 4 in the afternoon, and the quiet comfort of knowing someone would always be there when I came home. Ingrid had a way of making ordinary days feel steady. She remembered which neighbors were sick, which grandchildren had exams coming up, which flowers needed watering before the frost came. I handled the numbers, the repairs, the practical things. Together, we made a whole life out of small, unremarkable moments. Our son lived 2 hours away with his own family, visiting on holidays, always in a hurry. I didn't blame him. That's simply how life had become for everyone. Busy, distant, polite. We spoke on the phone every week, brief conversations about weather and work and his children's school grades. I told myself that was enough. I told myself a lot of things were enough back then. When Ingrid passed, the house didn't just lose a person. It lost its sound. The kettle she used every morning sat untouched on the stove for weeks, until I finally couldn't stand looking at it and put it away in a cupboard, out of sight. Her side of the closet stayed exactly as she'd left it, because touching it felt like erasing her, like admitting she was really gone in some final physical way I wasn't ready to face. The first few weeks, people came. Neighbors with casseroles, old colleagues with careful words, our son and his family staying through the funeral and a few days after. Then, as it always does, the world moved on, and I was left standing in the wreckage of a life that used to have 2 people in it. Winter came, and with it a kind of silence I had never experienced before, not even during the loneliest stretches of my working life. My days blurred together, grocery store, doctor's appointments, the 6 o'clock news I no longer really watched, just let play in the background so the apartment wouldn't feel so completely empty. I found myself talking to the television, just to hear a voice that wasn't my own thoughts echoing in an empty kitchen. My son called every Sunday, always the same question. "Papa, are you eating well? Are you taking your walks?" I always said yes. I never told him that some days I didn't get out of my chair until it was dark outside, that the walks he imagined me taking had quietly stopped weeks earlier, that I'd sit by the window watching other people's lives happen on the street below, instead of living my own. The worst part wasn't the grief itself. I expected that. Grief, in some strange way, I understood. It was the invisibility that caught me off guard. At the pharmacy, at the bakery, I had become the old man nobody really looked at twice. The pharmacist's assistant would hand me my prescription without quite meeting my eyes. The bakery clerk, who used to chat with Ingrid about her grandchildren, now simply took my order and moved to the next customer. I had spent my whole life being someone. An engineer who solved problems for a living, a husband who was needed at home, a father whose opinion mattered. Now I was just waiting. Waiting for what? I couldn't have told you. There were nights I sat in the dark long after I should have gone to bed, turning over the same question again and again. Was this simply what the rest of my life would look like? A slow, quiet fade until one day someone found me and it was over? I wasn't suicidal, I want to be clear about that, but I was disappearing in a way that felt almost as final. I had confused surviving with living, and I didn't even realize it until much later. My doctor, during a routine visit, asked gently if I'd considered speaking to someone about the loss. I brushed it off. Germans of my generation weren't raised to sit in a stranger's office and talk about feelings. We were raised to endure. So I endured month after month and told myself that was strength, when really it was just another kind of standing still. It was my neighbor, a retired teacher named Georg, who first mentioned it almost as a joke. Over coffee one gray afternoon in early spring. He'd read an article about Germans and other Europeans retiring in the Philippines, living comfortably on a fraction of what we spent at home, in a climate that never dipped below 20 degrees, surrounded by people who, according to the article, treated their elders with a warmth he said he hadn't felt in years. I laughed it off at first. It sounded like something out of a glossy travel brochure, not something a 69-year-old widower from Bavaria seriously considered. I told Georg as much, and he shrugged and said, "Suit yourself, Walter. I'm just telling you what I read." But that night, alone in my apartment with nothing but the hum of the refrigerator for company, I found myself searching online anyway. Photos of turquoise water filled my screen. Forums full of retirees, some alone, some widowed like me, some simply tired of the cold and the isolation of their old lives, describing mornings that didn't feel heavy anymore. One post, from a man roughly my age in Mindanao, described waking up to the sound of roosters instead of traffic, and feeling for the first time in years, glad to be alive. I read that sentence 4 times. I didn't tell anyone, not my son, not Georg. I just kept looking, night after night, the way you look at something you're not ready to admit you want. I told myself I was simply curious, simply passing the time. But curiosity doesn't usually keep a man awake until 2 in the morning, scrolling through property listings and expat forums with the kind of hunger I hadn't felt in over a year. For nearly 4 months, I researched everything with the same discipline I once brought to engineering projects. Visa requirements for retirees. The Special Resident Retirees Visa, I learned it was called. The cost of living in different provinces, comparing Cebu to smaller towns in the Visayas. Healthcare access, since at my age that wasn't something I could afford to overlook. Safety, since the German news back home painted a picture of the Philippines that I later learned was wildly incomplete. I joined an online forum of expatriates already living there, asking questions late into the night to strangers who somehow understood me better than the people I saw every week at the bakery or the pharmacy. They answered patiently, some of them clearly recognizing the particular kind of loneliness in my questions, even when I tried to disguise it as simple, practical curiosity. Doubt came in waves, the way it always does with decisions that matter. What would people say, a German man in his late 60s alone, moving across the world on what some might call a whim? Was I running away from something I should be facing head-on? Was I betraying Ingrid's memory by trying to build something new, somewhere she had never been, in a life she would never see? I sat with that question for a long time. Some nights it kept me from sleeping at all. But then I'd read another message from someone in that forum, a widow in her 70s from Hamburg who wrote, "I didn't come here to forget my husband. I came here to remember how to live." And something in me settled, quietly, the way a held breath finally releases. I told my son over the phone, my hands unsteady as I dialed, rehearsing the words beforehand like a nervous schoolboy. There was a long silence on the other end before he said, "Papa, if this is what you need, I'll support you." It wasn't the resistance I had braced myself for. It was relief, both his and mine. A relief so sudden it nearly brought me to tears right there in my kitchen. I sold most of what filled that too-large house, furniture Ingrid and I had chosen together over the decades, kitchen items neither of us ever really used, a dining table that had hosted 40 years of family dinners and now sat waiting for a stranger to haul it away. Piece by piece the house emptied, and strangely, so did some of the weight in my chest. Each item that left felt less like a loss and more like setting something down I'd been carrying for far too long. My son helped me sort through the last of it, and at one point, holding up an old photo album, he asked quietly if I was sure. I told him the truth. I wasn't sure of anything anymore, except that staying in that apartment, in that silence, was going to be the death of whatever part of me was still alive. He nodded, and that was the last time either of us questioned the decision out loud. The flight was long, nearly 18 hours with layovers in Doha and Manila. I remember landing in Cebu, stepping out of the airport into heat and humidity, unlike anything Bavaria had ever offered me, my shirt sticking to my back within minutes and feeling for the first time in over a year something close to nervous excitement instead of dread. It was such an unfamiliar sensation that it took me a moment to even recognize it for what it was. The first weeks were disorienting in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, despite all my research. The traffic was chaotic compared to German order. Motorbikes weaving between cars, horns used as a kind of constant conversation rather than an alarm. The language barrier, despite many locals speaking English quite well, still left gaps, small misunderstandings at the market, or with a landlord that left me feeling foolish and out of place. I missed the quiet predictability of home more than once, sitting alone in a rented apartment during those first weeks, wondering if I'd made a terrible, irreversible mistake at an age when mistakes are harder to undo. There were nights I lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds through the walls, a rooster that seemed to have no concept of what time actually meant, music from a neighbor's radio, voices speaking a language I couldn't yet follow, and felt more foreign than I had ever felt in my own life. But something else was happening too, slowly, almost without my noticing. My landlady, a woman named Rosa, brought me food on my third night because she noticed I hadn't gone out to buy groceries. She didn't ask if I wanted it. She simply knocked, handed me a covered plate, and said, "You eat now, okay?" before walking away as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. In Germany, such a gesture from a near stranger would have felt intrusive. Here, it felt like being caught by someone before I even realized I was falling. A group of retirees, Australian, American, one other German who'd been there almost a decade, invited me to their weekly breakfast at a small cafe by the water. Nobody asked what I used to be, what my profession was, what my pension amounted to. They asked who I was now, what I liked to do with my mornings, whether I'd tried the local mangoes yet. It was such a simple shift in questions, and yet it changed something fundamental in how I saw myself. Slowly, the strangeness became familiar. I learned to bargain gently at the market, the way the locals did, with a smile rather than an argument. I learned which tricycle drivers to trust with my safety and which ones to politely wave off. I started taking morning walks along the shore, not because a doctor told me to, not out of some grim sense of obligation to my health, but because I genuinely wanted to see the sunrise over water for the first time in my 69 years of life. 3 months in, I helped a local family fix a broken water pump using skills from my engineering days, skills I hadn't thought about in years, tucked away like Ingred's clothes in that closet back home. Word spread through the small community quickly. Suddenly I wasn't the quiet foreign widower everyone regarded with polite curiosity. I was the engineer again, useful, needed, seen in a way I hadn't been seen since before I retired. Children in the neighborhood started waving at me by name. An older woman who ran a small store began setting aside my favorite brand of coffee when new stock arrived, without my ever having to ask. These were small things, almost embarrassingly small when I try to describe them now, but they added up day after day, into something that felt suspiciously like belonging. I began to notice, too, how differently age was treated here. Back home, growing old had felt like a slow process of becoming invisible, of being handled rather than consulted. Here, elders were greeted with a specific gesture of respect, a hand brought to the forehead, a term of address reserved for those who had lived long enough to have earned it. It wasn't performative. It was simply how things were done, generation after generation, and being on the receiving end of that respect for the first time in years did something to my posture, my mood, the way I walked down the street. A year later, my days looked nothing like Munich. Mornings began with coffee on a small balcony overlooking a street full of motorbikes and vendors calling out to each other, the smell of someone's breakfast cooking drifting up from below. Afternoons might mean fixing something for a neighbor, or simply sitting with the breakfast group by the water, laughing about nothing in particular, the way Ingrid and I used to laugh over nothing at our own kitchen table decades ago. I still think about Ingrid every single day. That never stopped, and I never wanted it to. I keep a small photo of her on the shelf by my bed, and some evenings I talk to her quietly, telling her about the day, the way I used to when she was still beside me to listen. But grief here doesn't feel like drowning anymore. It feels like a companion walking quietly beside me, while I keep moving forward, rather than a weight pinning me to the floor of an empty apartment. My son visited last year, staying for 2 weeks. I watched him relax in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. Watched him watch me laughing with my new friends at breakfast. Watched something in his face soften with what I can only describe as relief. Before he left, he told me it was the first time since his mother died that he'd stopped worrying about me every single day. That more than anything told me I had made the right choice. There is a strange arithmetic to grief that nobody warns you about, one that has nothing to do with money and everything to do with objects. In the months after Ingrid passed, I discovered that a house doesn't just contain furniture, it contains evidence. Her reading glasses on the nightstand left exactly where she set them down the last night of her life. A half-finished crossword puzzle in the newspaper, her handwriting trailing off mid-answer. A jar of her favorite plum jam in the pantry, which I couldn't bring myself to open or throw away, so it simply sat there, a small monument to an ordinary Tuesday that had once been perfectly unremarkable. I became, without meaning to, a kind of curator of my own loss. Every room held an exhibit. The bathroom cabinet still had her perfume, and some mornings I would open it just to smell it, standing there in my bathrobe like a man visiting a museum dedicated entirely to a version of his life that no longer existed. I told no one about this habit. I'm not sure I could have explained it even if someone had asked. My son, on one of his visits, gently suggested that perhaps it was time to think about sorting through some things. I heard the kindness in his voice, and I also heard, underneath it, his own discomfort at watching his father live inside a shrine. I told him I wasn't ready. He didn't push. That was 6 months before Georg first mentioned the Philippines, and looking back now, I think some part of me already knew that clearing out that house would eventually mean clearing out something in myself as well, and I wasn't ready for either. There's rarely a single moment that changes a life, no matter how the stories we tell later try to compress everything into one dramatic scene. But if I had to choose one night, it would be this. It was February, bitterly cold, the kind of cold that gets into your joints and stays there. I had gone to bed early, as I often did those days, simply because there was nothing left in the evening worth staying awake for. I woke at 3 in the morning, and instead of falling back asleep, I lay there staring at the ceiling, doing something I hadn't allowed myself to do in over a year. I imagined the next 10 years of my life exactly as they were, unchanged. The same chair, the same news at 6, the same unopened jar of plum jam, the same Sunday phone call where I told my son I was fine. I imagined myself at 75, at 80, still sitting in that chair, having simply run out the clock rather than lived it. The thought terrified me more than Ingrid's death itself had, which surprised me, and which I still find strange to admit out loud. Her death was something that happened to me. This slow disappearing was something I was doing to myself, day by day, decision by tiny decision, simply by not deciding anything at all. I got up, made myself a cup of tea I didn't finish, and opened my laptop. I went back to that forum I'd been quietly reading for weeks, the one full of retirees living in the Philippines, and for the first time, instead of just reading, I wrote a post of my own. I introduced myself. I said I was a 69-year-old widower from Bavaria, an engineer, and that I was tired of waiting to die quietly in a house too big for one person. Within an hour, 3 people had responded, each with some version of the same message. Come, you won't regret it. None of us do. Not everyone in my life understood the decision, and I want to be honest about that, because I think it does a disservice to pretend the whole process was universally supported. My sister-in-law, Ingrid's younger sister, called me the week I announced my plans and asked, with real hurt in her voice, whether I was trying to erase her sister from my life by running off to some island. I understood where the question came from. Grief makes people protective of the person they lost, sometimes more protective of the memory than of the person left behind to carry it. I told her the truth, as gently as I could, that I wasn't running from Ingrid. I was running from the version of myself that grief had left behind, the version that had stopped living somewhere around the same time she stopped breathing. I told her Ingrid would have hated watching me become a ghost in my own home, far more than she would have minded me finding warmth and sunlight on the other side of the world. My sister-in-law didn't fully accept this at the time. We didn't speak for almost 2 months after that call. She wrote to me eventually, nearly a year later, after seeing photos my son had shared of me at the breakfast table by the water, laughing with people I now considered close friends. Her message was short. "You look like yourself again. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." I keep that message saved on my phone. It reminds me that people's fear for us often looks like judgment, when really it's just love that hasn't caught up yet to what we needed. The early months in the Philippines weren't just about culture shock in the abstract sense. They were about the practical, unglamorous work of building an entirely new daily structure at an age when most men have long since stopped rebuilding anything. I had to learn where to buy groceries that felt familiar, and where to simply accept that certain German staples weren't coming back into my life, and that this was fine. I had to learn a new banking system, a new pharmacy, new paperwork for my retiree visa that had to be renewed and monitored with the same discipline I once brought to factory inspections. Rosa, my landlady, became something between a friend and an informal guide. She taught me which market stalls sold the freshest fish in the early morning, which jeepney routes to avoid during the afternoon heat, and how to say enough basic Bisaya to make the vendors laugh rather than simply stare at the awkward German mangling their language. I made a habit of writing down new phrases in a small notebook, the same kind of methodical habit I once used to track engineering specifications, and slowly, month by month, the notebook filled up. I started attending a small weekly gathering at a community center nearby, mostly local retirees, and a handful of foreigners like myself, where we played cards, sometimes chess, and talked about everything and nothing. An old fisherman named Mang Thomas, missing half his teeth and possessing what seemed like an endless supply of patience, taught me to fish from the shore using nothing but a hand line and years of instinct I couldn't hope to replicate. I never caught much, he never seemed to mind. "You come back tomorrow," he'd say every single time, as if the fish were beside the point entirely, which I eventually realized they were. Of all the relationships I built in that first year, the one with Rosa's youngest son, a boy of about 9 named Junjun, surprised me the most. He had lost his own father 2 years before I arrived, an accident on a fishing boat during a storm, and something about the two of us, both carrying a hole shaped like someone we'd loved, seemed to draw us toward each other without either of us really trying. He started appearing on my balcony some afternoons, ostensibly to practice his English, though I suspect his mother had gently encouraged the visits once she noticed how quiet I still was in those first months. We would sit together while I helped him with homework I barely understood, written in a curriculum entirely foreign to my own schooling decades earlier. In exchange, he taught me local games, laughed uproariously at my terrible pronunciation, and once, without any warning, asked me if I missed my wife the way he missed his father. I told him yes, every single day, and that the missing probably never fully goes away, but that it does eventually learn to sit quietly beside you instead of on top of you, crushing the air out of your lungs. He nodded with the kind of solemn understanding that children carry more often than adults give them credit for, and then asked if I wanted to see the paper boat he'd folded that morning. That was the whole conversation. It was also somehow one of the most meaningful conversations I've had since Ingrid died. Word travels strangely among people our age. A photo I posted online, of myself standing waist-deep in warm water at sunrise, reached an old colleague from the factory back in Munich, a man named Rudolf, who had also lost his wife 2 years before I lost mine. He wrote me a message that began, "Walter, is this real, or are you finally losing your mind in your old age?" I laughed out loud reading it, alone on my balcony, in a way I hadn't laughed in longer than I could remember. We exchanged messages for weeks. He asked about the visa process, the cost of a small apartment, whether a man his age, 71, with a bad hip and a worse temper, by his own admission, could really start over somewhere so unfamiliar. I told him what the forum had told me, that starting over doesn't erase what came before, it simply gives what came before somewhere new to rest. He arrived 4 months later with 2 suitcases and an expression of terror I recognized immediately, because I'd worn it myself getting off that plane in Cebu. Watching Rudolph go through his own version of those first disorienting weeks, the traffic, the language, the strange hours of the roosters, gave me something I hadn't expected: purpose. I found myself in the position Georg had once occupied for me. Except now I was the one with answers, the one who could say, yes, it feels wrong at first, and then one morning it simply doesn't anymore. I walked him through the market, introduced him to Rosa, sat with him at the breakfast table by the water until his own laugh came back, tentative at first, then fuller. Rudolph wasn't the last. Over the following year, 3 other men from our old circle back in Bavaria reached out, each in his own quiet way, asking the same unspoken question: is it too late for me too? I never had a formal answer beyond my own life as evidence. 2 of them eventually visited, though only one, a widower named Eric, ultimately decided to stay permanently, buying a small plot of land not far from my own apartment, where he now grows vegetables he swears taste better than anything Bavaria ever produced, though I suspect that has more to do with who he's become than the actual soil. There is something particular about being useful to another man, carrying the same kind of grief you once carried. It doesn't erase your own loss, but it does something almost as valuable. It proves that the loss doesn't have to be the last chapter, that there's a whole life still available on the other side of it, if a person is only willing to take that first frightening step onto the plane. If I could speak to the man I was 2 years ago, sitting in that too large house in Bavaria, letting the television talk to an empty room, telling his son he was fine every single Sunday, I don't know that he would have listened. Grief makes a person stubborn in strange ways. It convinces you that enduring quietly is the same thing as healing, when really it's often just another way of standing still while the years pass you by. I would tell him that the ache for Ingrid doesn't get smaller by staying in the rooms she once filled. If anything, staying made the ache louder, because every object, every silence, every unused kettle was a reminder of exactly what was missing, with nothing new to balance it against. I would tell him that moving across the world doesn't mean leaving her behind. I carry her with me every single day, in the small habits I never broke, in the way I still reach for 2 cups out of instinct some mornings before catching myself. I would tell him, too, that the fear of what people might think, the German man in his late 60s running off to Southeast Asia, some might say chasing a fantasy, is a fear not worth carrying. Most of the people who might judge such a decision are, themselves, sitting quietly in houses too large for one person, too afraid of judgment to make any change at all. I understand that fear intimately now because I lived inside it for over a year, but I no longer let it make my decisions for me. I would tell him one more thing, the thing that took me longest to understand, that starting over at 69 isn't a betrayal of the life that came before. It's a continuation of it, written in a new language, in a new climate, surrounded by new faces, but built, every single day, on the same foundation Ingrid and I spent 4 decades laying together. She taught me how to love a life fully. I simply learned, much later than I expected to, that the lesson didn't expire when she did. People sometimes ask if I regret leaving Germany. I tell them the truth. I didn't leave to escape my old life, and I didn't leave to escape Ingrid's memory. I left because staying meant slowly disappearing, and I wasn't ready to disappear. Not yet. Not while there was still some version of living left in me to find. At 69, I thought my story was mostly finished, that the best I could hope for was managing the years quietly until they ran out, the way so many of us are taught to expect once we've retired, once we've buried a spouse, once the world seems to have decided we've had our turn. I was wrong. Growing older doesn't have to mean growing smaller. Sometimes it means finally being brave enough to choose, for yourself, what the rest of your story looks like, even if that choice takes you 18 hours away from everything familiar. If you're watching this and you're standing where I once stood, alone, uncertain, wondering if it's too late to want something new, it isn't. It never is. I am living proof, an old German engineer with sand between his toes most mornings, that the last chapter of a life doesn't have to be the quietest one. Sometimes it can be the one where you finally, truly begin to live. Some evenings, sitting on that balcony with the sound of the street below and the smell of someone's dinner cooking, I try to imagine explaining all of this to the man I was during that first winter alone. The one who let the television talk to an empty room, who told his son he was fine every single Sunday, who kept a jar of plum jam sealed shut because opening it felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. I don't think words alone could have convinced him. He would have needed to feel the warmth on his own skin, to hear Junjun's laughter over a badly folded paper boat, to taste Rosa's cooking on a night he hadn't asked for it and hadn't expected to need it so badly. What I can tell you, watching this from wherever you are, is that grief and joy were never meant to live in separate houses. I carry Ingrid with me on every one of these mornings, in every conversation with Rudolph and Eric, in every small kindness Rosa's family extends without being asked. The love doesn't end when the location changes. It simply learns to breathe in new air, the way I did, the way I suspect any of us can, if we're only willing to let it.